UTS Impact Studios presents History Lab.
This painting sanitizes something savage from a European perspective about this person's visage, his countenance.
There's sort of a naturalist edge to this. There's sort of a cataloging of the world, looking at animals, looking at fishing, looking at the natives.
I mean, I look at that image and for me, it's ridiculous. You know, sorry, but it's just,
This is Unsettling Portraits,
Season 6 of History Lab.
a 3-part podcast series that looks closely at the history of portraiture, colonialism, and First Nations responses.
I'm Kate Fullagar.
And I'm Mike McDonnell. We are both historians of empire and its encounter with Indigenous peoples in the past.
And I think it would be good for me to take these images to different tribal communities and have a conversation with them around them and see what they're seeing, it just like you're asking me.
It may be a little bit unsettling for everybody.
We're smart enough as human beings to deal with this.
Episode 2, Facing Off.
From Botany Bay to Aotearoa.
Kate, what is this music? What are we listening to here?
This is a recording of a song obviously done recently, but it's a song that we know Ben-nel-long and his compatriot who went with him to Britain, Jo sung to their London hosts in 1793. We even know the venue in which they sung it. It was in Mount Street in Mayfair. And they sung it to the person who put them up while they were living in Mayfair, William Waterhouse. Amongst the audience was a Welsh folklorist who took down the notation of this song, and it found its way all the way to two Indigenous singers, Clarence Slockie and Matthew Doyle, who performed this song in 2010, I think it was, near Sydney Opera House. So it's our closest thing that we have to Ben-nel-long's voice while he was in London.
So it's interesting, Kate. Certainly when I came to Sydney, I was made aware of Ben-nel-long, but never really got to know anything beyond a very kind of static, flat image. So I just wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about Ben-nel-long's presence, but also that absence.
Well, Ben-nel-long, particularly for Sydney people, is a person that most people would know. I mean, you'd see his name everywhere in Sydney. Ben-nel-long was a Wongal man, which is sort of from today's Balmain area. And the reason why he's famous in the history books is because he was the first important Indigenous interlocutor for the colonists. But I think he's more than just a go-between. I argue in my work on Ben-nel-long that he represents someone who maintained an Indigenous life and maintained his own personal sovereignty through invasion. In some ways, you know, looking at the two sides of him and actually trying to move away from the static, flat, as you called it, image of Ben-nel-long, you can actually see the dynamism of his life when we compare these two portraits that we've started looking at in the first episode.
Picture this.
This first one here shows Ben-nel-long in 1790. He's only known the colonists for about 1 year at this point.
It's a picture of a man.
Of this person framed in a circle.
His front on.
He's got very dark skin, curly hair, brown eyes.
He's looking straight at whoever is doing the artwork.
He has painting on his body, so two kind of semicircles starting from his sternum that go up over his shoulders. He's then got another white stripe that goes across the bridge of his nose.
It's actually titled Ben-nel-long When Angry. He doesn't come across, I don't think, particularly furious, but he certainly comes across a little bit wary. And we can see he's represented in his Eora painted self-presentation with his eyes definitely on the colonial game and not taking his eyes off it. Only 3 years later, once Ben-nel-long had visited London, here's another representation based on a sketch of someone who was in England with him, another British person, of course. And the difference is so stark, isn't it?
Picture this.
I'm seeing a person extracted out of an environment and put onto a blank piece of paper.
He's got very fine Western clothes on.
Wearing a uniform or outfit that seems to belong to the colonists of Australia.
And in the background, there's shields and there's clubs and stone axes and spears.
The way that it's designed.
Side-on profile.
In front of these weapons.
Items that look like they've been made of wood or rocks or animal teeth.
And what the artist has done is intentional, right? It's like, why isn't the figure out with the weapons? Why are they placed like that?
I think it's Bennelong. And I think it's when the British took him back to England.
It's almost like the aftermath of the event.
Yeah, I think that's definitely what this painting was trying to get, is that we've gone through this process of colonising this place where all these objects are. We've taken one of these men and we've changed them into more or less an Englishman, and he's put all of these savage indicators of his culture behind him.
And what was he doing in London, Kate?
Ben-nel-long, as we know, had this reasonably close political diplomatic relationship with Arthur Phillip, the Governor of New South Wales. Their relationship was quite a good one. I wouldn't go so far as to say they were friends, but an important founding relationship for colonial history. When Phillip went home after his 5-year tenure as governor, he took Ben-nel-long with him, and Ben-nel-long was a willing traveller. So they depart Sydney Cove the end of 1792 and arrive in London 1793.
So you're saying that Ben-nel-long really wanted to go to London?
Definitely, there's no sign that he was coerced into being there. Ben-nel-long, we know, had been trying to help ease the potential violence that could occur in the colony for the last several years. I think he went to London because he wanted to extend that diplomatic exercise. It was his way of furthering his mastery of this culture, which he realised by this stage at least was not going to go away anytime soon. When he's in London, he gets sketched by, we think, his landlord, William Waterhouse. And that's the image that goes on to serve as the basis for this later portrait. Ben-nel-long stays in London for 2 years, really as a guest of the British government, and I think he enjoyed it for the first year or so. As I mentioned, he brought with him a younger kinsman called Yamarowani, who unfortunately after that first year sickens and dies, and he's buried over in England. It's pretty obvious that from about that point, Ben-nel-long is starting to lose his interest in the whole exercise. He comes home by 1795. After 1795, increasingly Ben-nel-long distances himself from colonial politics altogether.
Kate, we learned a lot in the first episode from Joseph Pearce and Gordon Henry. For Ben-nel-long, who might we look to?
Yes. Ben-nel-long was part of a wider Sydney Aboriginal group that spoke the language Dharug. So I thought we might turn to our colleague Jo Rey.
Hello, Mike. I'm Jo.
Lovely to meet you.
Oh, hi, Kate.
Hello. Oh, I so appreciate you doing this.
My pleasure.
Jo Rey is a scholar from Macquarie University and a Dharug woman.
I guess the best way into this maybe is to ask you a little bit about your own background and what Ben-nel-long means to you personally.
Well, first of all, as I'm on Dharug country, at Guymarrigal country, I'd like to pay my respects to elders and recognise that they always have been and always will be caring for country. I was born and raised on Wallamadigal country, which is just across the river from where I'm speaking. My ancestry on my mother's side goes through to the Dharug connection, And it's on my mother's father's side that I am connected into James Squires. He was a convict and was a dear friend of Bennelong's. So my sense of connection to Bennelong's story is very much around the relationship between him and James Squires, and also the fact that Bennelong travelled to London. He was an emissary from his people, but my understanding from the colonial perspective was that he was the so-called example, of the colonised native. And so those two pictures that you've provided me with, the one in 1790, he is painted up for ceremony. The implication of what was written was that this paint up was for war, but I've checked with my mob and that's actually ceremonial because it was white paint. If it was going to be for war, it would be red paint. But certainly the 1798 picture where he's dressed in all his colonial finery, that would have been required of him when he went to London. And so that 1798 image was him conforming to whatever the rules of London were at that time. But that didn't necessarily express who he was.
Yeah.
I guess I connect to Bennelong's story with my own story of being an expat, living outside of my language, my culture in Europe for 7 years, and understanding what that expatriate experience is like.
Yes. It's beautifully put. I've been thinking about Bennelong for such a long time, but to think of him as an expat, it's a nice way of thinking about that revision and that recasting of Bennelong.
Yes. And then I link it back to his return to his people and how the first thing he did was take off all his clothes and rejoin his mob. And for me, that indicates that his desire to return to his place of belonging and the culture, his own culture, was much stronger than any sense of, oh, I'm the civilized man now. But having said that, he was never going to be the same person that returned as he was before he left.
It's just so moving to think about the full life story of Bennelong.
And Jo, I just wanted to come back to the 1790 painting. You've already kind of begun to upend our ideas about that. You mentioned that you shared it with others. We're just wondering about your insights about it.
Well, I look at that as I think most people would look at it, given its context of 1790. And this painting would have been done by a white colonising individual. And so for me, what I'm seeing is the interpretation of the white colonising individual who's painted it. I just look at it and take it with a grain of salt. I don't reckon it indicates too much, except to say that he was obviously a slim person, he was obviously young, he was obviously painted up. It's not a caricature, but it's not very representative of a reality either, in my opinion. But, having said that, there's a greater context of connection for Aboriginal people, in my opinion, to the 1790 image, just because it reflects our culture rather than the 1798 one, which reflects the values of colonisers. We don't value, I look at that 1798 image and for me, it's ridiculous. Sorry, but that's,
no, absolutely.
Yeah. It's just,
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Jo, you've talked a little bit about the 1798 image and in some sense the kind of the fabrication of both images by the colonizers. And I just, sometimes I get frustrated and wonder what's the value of these kind of images at all. And I just wondered what your sense of that might be. Is it good that we have these images or not?
That's an interesting question, you see, because that goes into the collection, the power of collection and the problem of collection and the reliance by Western society on collection for truth. I struggle with this notion that the only truth can be written truth or visual truth as interpreted by others, with no respect for oral tradition. And that wipes out 65,000 years of culture that obviously has been carried forward through oral form and through images on rock faces and things like this that have been delivered. But this type of, where a painting or something like that is put into a museum, and therefore that is the valid truth. This is what whitefellas have declared is important, and if it's not in that form or those forms, then it doesn't count. And so for me, I'm all about caring for country and caring for country in the city. And so the eradication of our culture through the demolition of landscapes for housing and that human-centric approach to life, which came from 1788, because prior to that, it wasn't there. It was about human beings being within a network of species, not on top of it. And so for me, this type of evidence has to be challenged if we're going to have proper truth-telling. And in the context that we've got today on this continent so-called Australia, there's real significance in challenging all these notions of what is valid and what isn't valid. So that's my... I hope that's answered your question for you.
And actually, it really echoes. It's wonderful to hear you say that, because it really echoes Gordon Henry, our Anishinaabe guest. He was talking about portraits in North America and how they're isolated from country. And he was talking about how the portrait doesn't really speak to him because it's been taken out of that kind of country context.
Yep.
And I think you're saying effectively, in many ways, the same thing in a different way.
That's right.
So it's wonderful. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear that.
Oh, good. So, Yana Mabudri Gumada, walk with good spirit. Thank you very much, and I hope we cross paths again another time.
I hope so too.
Thank you.
Jo.
Yanu.
So, Kate, Jo Rey is making a really important point, right? Because a lot of what we see with the portraits that we've been looking at and with the texts and pieces of evidence that we find in the archives, we're only getting a little glimpse of a moment when Indigenous peoples came into contact with Europeans. But Ben-nel-long's story kind of reminds us that there's a huge amount that took place outside, beyond the ken of Europeans and beyond the written record of Europeans, that Indigenous peoples had their own lives, they had their own histories, that they had their own conflicts with other peoples that we don't know a lot about.
That's right. That's why it's particularly ironic to me that this second portrait of Ben-nel-long, when he's dressed up like a European gentleman and seems so kind of overpowered by English assimilationary forces, is at the exact moment when he actually himself starts turning away from Britain and does survive the turn away and very successfully lives back amongst his Eora and refuses assimilation completely.
So, Kate, where are we going next?
So now we're moving back in time. We're moving back just 20 years and we're staying in the Sydney Harbour region. We're moving, though, from the Sydney Harbour southern shore to what the colonists called Botany Bay or Guyagal land. 20 years earlier, James Cook's Endeavour ship is in the harbour. It's not Phillip's first fleet, but Cook's exploratory Endeavour ship. And he's arriving from the east, from Aotearoa waters. I think what few people realise is that he carried on board this ship a Pacific Islander called Tupaia, who turned out not only to be a star navigator who helped Cook through his voyages actually all the way from Tahiti, but also an artist. And fortunately, we have 10 pictures that Tupaia produced that reside in the British Library.
Tupaia You know, the things that I'm going to say about Tupaia are coming from my perspective as a Māori person from Aotearoa, from New Zealand.
This is our good friend Alice Te Punga Somerville.
Te Punga without the G.
Or Te Punga, sorry. Alice is currently in Canada. Thanks so much for coming here, Alice.
Kia ora, it's really good to be in conversation with you both.
So we've just been turning towards the art of Tupaia. Do you want to tell us a little bit about who Tupaia was?
Absolutely. So Tupaia was from Ra'iatea in French Polynesia, or as Chantal Spitz would have us understand it, French-occupied Polynesia. And he was an important figure in the story that Māori tell of Cook's initial voyage to New Zealand. So even though that story's been told often as this kind of white ship meeting these brown people, in fact, Tupaia was on board. He was on board because he was a really skilled navigator, a knowledge holder, a trained religious person. You know, it seems like a lot of the Europeans who met him, who left written records, are pretty clear that they're really impressed by this guy. And so he ended up coming into my world, the New Zealand Māori world, 1769, not actually to the side of the North Island that I come from. So it's sort of not my story. He came to the East Coast, but he's a really important figure for us understanding the way that the initial contacts between Europeans in the region actually also were reconnections between Indigenous peoples of the region.
So I guess that gives us a little bit of the background of why Tupaia ended up in Kamei, in what Australians call Botany Bay. What do you know of that, and what was he doing there?
So he ended up travelling with Cook on his voyage. He went through a number of parts of the Pacific. Because so many of the islands, at least in the part of the Pacific that I come from, Polynesia, so many of the languages are so closely spoken, he was actually able to be useful not just to get there, but then also to serve as a kind of translator all the way through. My understanding is once they got to what's now known as Australia, he actually found that his vast facility and the range of Polynesian languages was no help to him there. And so it became a really important point of understanding there were points of Indigenous connection between all the places that Cook had been with him up to that point, and that connection did not extend to Australia. And so perhaps a kind of moment of understanding that Indigenous Australia comes from a really, really different kind of deep history than the rest of us newbies from the Pacific.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? And it's fascinating that because he had a history of connection with other Indigenous peoples through the Pacific, when he gets to Kamei and he finds that linguistically there is no longer a connection, perhaps he finds a connection through his own graphic representations. Before we turn to the Pacific images of Tupaia, do you have any initial thoughts about this wonderful picture of three Kamego Fisher people?
Yeah, I think one of the points of connection that Tupaia can see, obviously, despite linguistic and cultural and other kinds of difference that would have been quite apparent, and maybe a little bit unsettling for everybody, because up to that point, both he and Cook and all his guys had been kind of bumping into places and yet being able to make themselves known. And yet in that moment, one of the things that I like about the fact that the thing that has survived is of Fisher people is there's a point of connection there in terms of activity. And so even if the language is different, the people are different, the cultural protocol no doubt felt really suddenly quite unfamiliar and sort of almost unsettlingly so, there's this point of connection of like, oh, okay, these people are fishing. This is an important part, obviously, of the way that we all practice our cultures as well as feed ourselves through the region. So I think it's interesting that this depiction is of a familiar activity, which plays up perhaps more connection rather than this is something which is unfamiliar to us, even if there are specificities to the, you know, the shape of the canoe or what have you.
And I guess, Alice, moving backwards in time now, before the voyage to Australia, we've also got an image, Tupaia's image of the Māori man with a crayfish.
This looks like an exchange of some sort. Picture this. Like a peaceful exchange.
I get a feeling that this is like Aotearoa and a Māori person dealing with a white person.
They both seem to be the same height or at the same level as each other.
In between the two, there is a lobster. The figure on the right seems to have maybe some kind of cloth.
Or maybe it's some sort of document.
It's faint. He's got his hands extended out. I'm not sure, maybe taking the lobster, maybe giving the lobster.
There's definitely some sort of exchange going on.
The other thing to note about the image is that it doesn't look like it's done by a professional artist. It looks like a bit more of a layperson's sketch of this taking place.
So that image is totally iconic. I think it was Anne Salmon's book, The Trial of the Cannibal Dog, was the first time that I came into connection with this image, where she kind of shared that this was in fact produced by an Indigenous person. So up to that point, it kind of circulated as an image that some random bloke on the ship had made. For me, as a Māori person with an interest in our connections with the region, that already reframes the image completely. Okay, so the first image produced that represents Māori engagement with non-Māori and with Europe is produced by another Indigenous person from elsewhere. Okay, the other thing that it tells me, and that I used to share with my students when I taught Pacific Studies, is as long as there have been white people in New Zealand, there have been Pacific Islanders or Indigenous people to the Pacific, right? So, for me, that image is such a beautiful interruption to a kind of false narrative of the state as being kind of Māori and European, and then these other random Pacific migrants came at some point later, right? So there's something kind of really beautiful about that anyway.
Yeah.
Turns out there's another layer, and the other layer is that what you see in the image is a moment of exchange, and it's a moment of exchange between the European person holding out either some white fabric, cloth, or paper. And we're like, oh, this is all very European, stands in for European culture and Englishness and so on. And the Māori person is holding out a crayfish, a koura, right? Okay, raw materials exchanged for produced materials, cloth and paper as sign of a certain kind of civilization, the rawness of the lobster. Okay, that we can see why people love this image, right? It stands in for everything. But it turns out that the thing that the European person is actually offering for exchange in that moment, that Tupaia captures, that I'm pretty sure no one else would have thought to capture, is that what was being extended was actually a piece of tapa, a piece of the cloth that's made from paper mulberry, a kind of tree that's found all around the region, and that some people would know as tapa, masi, hiapo, siapo, kapa, ngatu. So this thing that the European is extending is actually Tahitian tapa, right? And probably Tahitian, because that's what they just picked up from Tahiti when they were cruising through, and also picking up Tupaia, but also because one of the aspects that I understand of their tapa is that it's often unadorned or undyed, and so that kind of very white tapa, which led everyone to go, oh, must be some white cotton from a mill in London or something like that. So again, for me, that's about a reconnection point, actually, that it's through this European technology, through the ship, through the arrival of Europeans, that the actual exchange that's occurred and that Tupaia thought was important to depict was this kind of reconnection of Māori with tapa. Because unfortunately for me, my ancestors picked quite a cold southern spot in the Pacific. So what that means is that actually the paper mulberry doesn't really grow there except in a couple of regions. And so we didn't have these lengths of tapa that they could produce in places like Tahiti, Aotearoa, and so on. And so for Māori, it was like, holy moly, our great-great-greats weren't exaggerating when they said these little shred bits of tapa actually come in whole sheets back in our ancestral homeland. Yeah. Okay, and then there's just one more layer. Okay, I'm going to add one more layer. And the additional layer is that, in theory, the European dude who's involved in the exchange, I think it might have been Banks.
That's Joseph Banks. He was the naturalist on the Endeavour with Cook.
So anyway, turns out I was reading something and Banks was actually asked about this later in his life. Oh, do you remember that moment on the beach, the moment of exchange that was represented in this way? He was like, oh, yes, no, I do remember that. Yeah, we exchanged some crayfish for some nails. Yeah. And so even later in his own life, he was unable to accurately recall that moment of exchange, and instead kind of was already accidentally, unconsciously in the process of rewriting the significance of the reconnection of the Pacific part of the exchange by assuming that Māori would be interested in acquiring European goods rather than acquiring tapa.
Wow. That's an amazing story. I love the idea that Tupaia was capturing this moment of significance between Pacific peoples and the Māori rather than Europeans and the Māori.
Absolutely. It's kind of like he's making a snapshot for home. Like, hey, it got here in one piece to our people, rather than kind of going, oh, look, these Maori people are being drawn into the capitalist network of the colonizer from England, like it sort of beautifully repositions what's kind of happening in these moments that get so overwritten. And that's why I kind of really like the Banks misremembering as well. Like, even the guy who was actually there misremembers it. So no wonder 250 years later, we're still like, I don't know, it was probably something like nails or cotton.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I guess because I have just one final question then. A lot of scholars have thought that both of these all of the 10 Tupaia images that survive from the Endeavour voyage look like he studied European forms of representation and kind of appropriated them in these imagery. Do you have any thoughts about that? Do you think that maybe it is relevant at all, that it looks to Europeans now, that it looks like a European style? Maybe that's actually not the way that we should approach it.
Yeah, it's an intriguing thought. I probably have a few thoughts about that. One would be, given that the things that have remained in ways that remain accessible to us are things that have been collected and stored by Europeans, it seems likely to me that Europeans doing that collection and storing would be like, oh, this is a good one. Looks a bit like ours.
Yeah,
it's entirely possible in my imaginary that Tupaia may have produced many more texts than this, and maybe some of them looked a little less like they were engaging with those European artistic traditions. So I think there's kind of a quite pragmatic archives question here, and kind of what and who and what sorts of things. And if the question we're asking is about appropriation, I think on the one hand, appropriation feels inappropriate because appropriation has a connotation of a kind of power imbalance, where the person who is more powerful is able to take something and render it for their own purposes. And I'm not sure that the less powerful person gets to appropriate. On the other hand, maybe it's kind of fun to sometimes take the opportunity to put ourselves in those moments and not overwrite them too much with what we know about what happened next. And maybe it is a kind of appropriation. After all, these were just some kind of incompetent European sailors who didn't know how to get around the region that he knew so well. So maybe it's kind of nice to flip it on its head like that. I also think, I don't know a lot about Aotearoan culture, but one of the things that I am constantly in awe of is the capacity for our highly trained knowledge keepers and knowledge holders to not just demonstrate with proficiency our own kind of ways of doing things, but to, with a real curiosity and from a sense of cultural security, engage and learn about cultural forms, including material, artistic cultural forms from other Indigenous communities. So to me, I wonder if it also speaks to Tupaia's own training and significance as someone who's already kind of an intellectual person, already used to kind of having the cultural confidence and the curiosity and kind of learning this new way. I mean, you spend a lot of time on a boat when you're going somewhere. He probably had time to learn and to be trained, and I think it speaks to his capacity. And I'm just being really careful here, not kind of condescendingly saying like how interesting that a native person would be that clever, because that would be racist to say like, oh, I can't believe it, he's not stupid after all. But instead to kind of speak to this as maybe a continuation of his proficiency in other cultural forms.
Yeah, that's really good too,
Yeah.
Thank you, Alice.
Thanks, you guys.
That's fantastic, Alice.
Sweet as.
So this late 18th century era, as we've been talking about, Mike, really comes across as like kind of a turning point, doesn't it, in our history?
Yeah, we often think of the 18th century as a moment of imperial expansion, of movement of Europeans, of European conquest. But I think what we've discovered here is that really Indigenous mobilities and movement are really important parts of the story. If you think about even the Odawa, we know that the Odawa in North America interacted on a grand scale across the lakes. We know that the Anishinaabe were on the move. And then we've got Ostanako in Cherokee country, moving within North America, but also traveling to London, followed by Ben-nel-long.
Yeah, and here's Tupaia traversing the whole Pacific Ocean.
Yeah. So, Kate, we've had a look at Tupaia, this Pacific Islander who's moving with Cook and Europeans and depicting what he sees and thinking about what he sees and wanting to represent it. And I guess in our next episode, we're going to look at a few more Aboriginal and Pacific Island artists.
That's right, really seeing the legacy of the tradition started by Tupaia. There's an array, particularly in this country, in Australia, of Indigenous artists grappling with the tradition of portraiture, but also particularly with early modern times, 17th and 18th centuries.
Yeah. I think we as historians, we have a tendency to look backwards, but maybe by looking at Indigenous artists today, we can find a different way of viewing these portraits.
Oh, definitely.
So, join us in episode 3, when we'll meet some terrific contemporary Aboriginal and Pacific artists who have engaged with the colonial encounter in their work and who continue to unsettle the imperial fantasy of conquest.
History Lab.